Hello, welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young-Gyo Kim. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin concluded their first overseas trip to South Korea and Japan, during which the two secretaries reaffirmed the U.S. commitment to the denuclearization of North Korea. The United States and South Korea just wrapped up their 9-day springtime combined military exercise staged in a scaled-back manner due to the coronavirus pandemic and peace efforts with North Korea. Meanwhile, North Korea broke its conspicuous silence in recent months with a lambasting message to the Biden administration. Today, we'll discuss these and more. Joining me is Bruce Bennett, international defense researcher at the RAND Corporation. Dr. Bennett is an expert in Northeast Asia and military issues and has worked with the Office of the Secretary of Defense, the United States Pacific Command, and Central Command. David Maxwell also joins me today. He's senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Mr. Maxwell was a planner for the United Nations Command and the ROC U.S. Combined Forces Command. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Thank you. Great to be here.
First of all, Dr. Bennett, when you look back at this week's 2+2 meeting in Seoul, did you see greater emphasis was put on the alliance compared to the previous Trump administration?
Oh, absolutely. We have to remember that then candidate Biden, the week before the election in November, wrote an op-ed in the Korean media saying that he was going to make the alliance much closer and stronger. And he has literally carried that out, working on the special measures agreement, the burden sharing, working on other aspects, having the 2+2 meetings this week. He's clearly trying to make the alliance an important part of the U.S. security arrangement and make sure that everyone in Korea knows that we are close.
Mm-hmm. And North Korea made indeed some reactions to the two secretaries' visit to Seoul. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un's sister, Kim Yo-jong, and Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, Choi Sun-hee, consecutively released statements criticizing the U.S. But Secretary of State Blinken said he's more focused on the voices of allies and partners rather than on North Korea's statements. Mr. Maxwell, what do you make of Secretary Blinken's response?
Well, yeah, this continues. The Biden administration's focus is on allies first, and the Secretary of State is making sure that our allies know that we value the alliances and we value their views and opinions. And that was the primary purpose of the visit. He's not going to be swayed by North Korean propaganda and rhetoric. And while we have to take seriously North Korean statements, we also do not have to overreact to every one of them, since we understand how those statements fit into the regime's strategy to drive a wedge into and to harm the ROC-U.S. alliance. And again, all to support the blackmail diplomacy line of effort to the political warfare strategy. So I think Secretary Blinken was spot on. The alliance is what is important, and we are not going to be swayed by North Korean propaganda and outlandish rhetoric.
Mm-hmm. So as you two mentioned, during and before their visit to Tokyo and Seoul, Secretary Blinken and Secretary Austin stressed the trilateral cooperation among the U.S. and South Korea and Japan in dealing with North Korea. Dr. Bennett, do you think the Biden administration have in mind the military collaboration among these three countries?
Oh, absolutely. We hardly ever say the fact that the U.S. plans, in case of a war, to send a substantial amount of American military forces to Korea to support our alliance. To do that, we have difficulty with the limited infrastructure in Korea. In order to send that substantial amount of force, we have to have Japan. It's an absolute critical element of having adequate infrastructure to support our Korean ally. So in reality, from the very beginning, any response to North Korean warfare would be a trilateral activity. It has to be. And so I think the U.S., I think Secretary Blinken was emphasizing the fact that that is just a part of the way we need to think about operating in Northeast Asia.
All right. Dr. Bennett, can we go a little bit more in details? How can Korea, Japan, and the U.S. can collaborate militarily? We know like there's a dysomia between the Korea and Japan, but is there anything that Korea and Japan, United States can expand their cooperation?
Yeah, the U.S. has been talking a lot now about advanced command and control systems. JADC2 is the term that is usually used, where we want to be coordinated with our allies so that we all share a common picture of what is happening and a common picture of what actions we need to be taking together. This kind of cooperation doesn't happen if you only occasionally get together and talk a little bit. It's got to be a regular part of your military training. It's got to be a part of your information sharing. This is the way that things need to move so that we're efficient in the way we operate. In addition to, as I was arguing before, logistically, we need to work together because of the limited infrastructure that's available to us. We've got to have that cooperation.
Mr. Maxwell, could you share your insight as well on this trilateral cooperation in the military front?
Yes, trilateral cooperation is key to success in Northeast Asia for all three countries, Japan, Korea, and the United States. And one of the reasons that we know this trilateral cooperation is so important is because Kim is afraid of it, as is Xi Jinping in China. Both of them do not like trilateral cooperation. And so because of their fear, we know it's important. But there's already ongoing extensive military cooperation taking place between the three partners. And in Japan today, there is a Naval Operations Center that is conducting counter-proliferation coordination. And it's manned by South Korean officers, Japanese officers, U.S. officers, as well as other allied Five Eyes partners as well. And they are intelligence personnel, and they're tracking North Korean illicit activities and sanctions evasion activities to include ship-to-ship transfers. So the Biden administration hopes to improve on this, build on this, because not only do we need this trilateral cooperation in wartime, God forbid North Korea would be so foolish to attack the South, but we need this coordination during armistice really to counter North Korea's illicit activities.
Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said the alliance with South Korea has never been more important given unprecedented challenges both from North Korea and China. What kind of challenges is he talking about?
I think we have to recognize that the North Korean nuclear weapon threat is no longer something that can simply be ignored. There has been a tendency to not pay a lot of attention to it other than, well, we'll resolve it by negotiation. Now, operationally, we need to start thinking that this is a threat that could be devastating to Korea, to Japan, to the United States. And so we need to be more focused on how we counter this threat together, how we work together in dealing with that. This is an evolved security environment, and China poses a potential similar threat. In addition, as David said, there are all kinds of peacetime challenges that we face. Look at the Chinese economic warfare waged against South Korea in the aftermath of the THAAD deployment. That was pure economic warfare, costing South Korea billions of dollars. An alliance should be there to help support South Korea in that case, and it has been. And we do try to support each other against all of the actions of North Korea and China.
Mm-hmm. Does this mean the U.S. needs to work with South Korea not only on North Korea, but also on China militarily?
Yes, absolutely. The Biden administration has come in and taking a real values-based approach, human rights approach, but also really the great power competition is really between authoritarian governments and like-minded democracies. And that's really the ideology and ideological war that's taking place. In political warfare and economic warfare. And so the alliances are critically important. The United States has a free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. South Korea has a Southern strategy that's complementary to that strategy. But really, the important thing is that we share values, we share interests, we share strategy, not only towards North Korea, but throughout the region. And we should remember the 1953 Mutual Defense Treaty states that the purpose of the treaty is to defend both countries against threats in the Asia-Pacific region. It's not just focused on North Korea. In fact, the Mutual Defense Treaty doesn't even mention North Korea. And so the Mutual Defense Treaty is important for the fact that it focuses on national security and other interests of both countries in the Asia-Pacific region.
And what was distinctive about during this trip was that two secretaries used the term the denuclearization of North Korea rather than the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. And South Korean Foreign Minister Chung Eui-yong said using the word peninsula was more correct. What difference does the wording make?
Well, it depends upon your interpretation of the wording that you look at. North Korea has used the term denuclearization of the peninsula to mean that the U.S. breaks its nuclear umbrella for South Korea. But since Choi Sun-hui has said just 2 days ago that denuclearization is never going to happen, that for us to focus on it is not appropriate. We need to be starting to think about how do we get North Korea to stop building nuclear weapons. They're building a significant number each year, contrary to what Kim promised in 2018 when he said he was going to negotiate full elimination of his nuclear program. We've now got to start looking at how do we incentivize him to move back from nuclear weapons as a threat to the entire region, not just the U.S., not just South Korea, Japan, to other neighboring countries. North Korea is even a threat to China. Look at how audacious North Korea is, how they ignore oftentimes what China tells them to do. We really have some shared interests there, even with China, where we have some concerns. And those are things that we need to work.
Right. Dr. Bennett, just follow up on that. Do you think the United States and South Korea needs to clarify what or where they're aiming to denuclearize?
Oh, I think that's absolutely certain that we need to be very clear. The U.S. support of South Korea isn't involved with nuclear weapons on South Korean territory today. But if North Korea keeps building up nuclear weapons, that may be something the United States needs to consider in the future. North Korea's got to understand that if they change the nature of the situation on the peninsula, it may not get better for them. It may actually get worse. They've got to stop what they're doing. They've got to freeze their nuclear program and prepare to roll it back. But if they're going to resist that, things could change in ways they're not going to like, and China really is not going to like.
Mr. Maxwell, from what Mr. Chung Eui-yong said in South Korea about the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, did you see there could be some gap of how U.S. and the South Korea view the definition of the denuclearization?
While it's a term of art to say denuclearization of the entire Korean Peninsula, the reality is it's the denuclearization of North Korea. Now, the importance of this whole discussion, and there are differences not only between some in the U.S. and some in South Korea, but they're also among many of the Korea watchers. And this really illustrates the difference in views that people have. But the importance of this is that by talking about it, we can expose Kim Jong-un's strategy. And as Dr. Bennett correctly said, denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula to Kim Jong-un means an end of the ROK-U.S. alliance, withdrawal of U.S. troops, end of extended deterrence over South Korea and Japan. And the purpose of that is so that North Korea will have a military advantage so that it can coerce and extort, and if necessary, use force to dominate the Korean Peninsula, which is Kim Jong-un's ultimate objective.
And in addition to that, two allies, the United States and South Korea, didn't seem to fully agree on China. On the joint statement released after the 2+2 meeting in Seoul, China was not mentioned. This drew a stark contrast with the statement released in Tokyo. Dr. Bennett, do you think this highlights a possible point of difference between the two allies?
Well, we have to remember that China has been carrying on its Cold War strategy for decades now. As part of that strategy, they have made South Korea absolutely dependent upon trade with China. If China decides to undercut that trade, as they did in the aftermath of the THAAD deployment, it can be a serious problem for South Korea, cause major financial losses. So South Korea's position is very delicate relative to economics. And China got there by their own economic warfare strategy. They've been doing that for decades. South Korea, therefore, has to be more careful in the way that they deal with China, or China can retaliate and cause major economic problems for the South. That really gives you two conclusions. One, South Korea is prepared to work with the U.S. on China, but they have to be careful about not going too far. And number two, over time, South Korea needs to reevaluate its economic trade relations. China is a difficult partner because it wants to use trade to establish dependency and then dominance over its neighbors. And South Korea has got to be prepared to move back somewhat from that and change based upon what it's already experienced in terms of Chinese economic warfare.
Mr. Maxwell, what did you make of this?
Yeah, I agree. South Korea is walking a tightrope between China, its largest trading partner, and the United States, its security partner. And I think we respect this position, and that's why it wasn't highlighted in the statement. However, the important points in the statement reinforce the commitment to shared values, a rules-based international order, which is really the fundamental issue. And South Korea and the U.S. are committed to that. And that really goes against the intentions of China, really to countervene the rules-based international order and impose its own rules. So South Korea is committed to those ideals, and that's a good thing. But I would add to Dr. Bennett's important points in that when South Korea reevaluates its position, what it is going to learn is that it will have better defense, economic warfare defense, and a better capability to deal with China's hostile retaliation if it is part of the like-minded democracies and eventually part of the Quad, which I expect that it will be part of. But until then, we respect the fact that it's walking that economic tightrope with China, and we all expect Chinese economic warfare in retaliation.
Meanwhile, the United States and South Korea just finished their springtime combined military exercise. And Secretary Austin said military readiness is a top priority for the U.S. and South Korean alliance. In the previous Trump administration, the U.S. refrained from reacting to North Korea's short-range missile tests, saying they are standard tests. Dr. Bennett, do you think the Biden administration's approach towards North Korea's nuclear and missile tests will be different from that of the Trump administration?
Well, Trump was trying to maintain a relationship with Kim Jong-un, and so he focused on the April 2018 Kim commitment not to do long-range missile tests. What he missed was Kim's March 2018 commitment to do no missile, no nuclear tests. Kim has been violating that commitment he made in March when he asked for a summit meeting with President Trump consistently in last year and the year before. So I think the Biden administration is going to look at that and say he made a commitment. Not only that, he has UN Security Council resolutions dictating that he not do such tests. I think there will be a better tendency in the Biden administration to say any such testing is a violation of the Security Council, a violation of Kim's commitments. We have to ask in the end, can we trust Kim? There's not a lot of purpose in negotiating with North Korea if you cannot trust Kim Jong-un to do what he says he's going to do. And he hasn't been doing that. And so we have to ask, Kim, are you serious? Are you really prepared to do some of these things? Because if you are, demonstrate that you're serious.
All right. Mr. Maxwell, the same question to you. Will the Biden administration's reaction be different from Trump administration? Like, will they make any reaction to North Korea's short-range missile tests?
I think the U.S. will demonstrate the requisite strategic reassurance to its allies, South Korea and Japan, that it will defend our mutual interest. And it will also demonstrate the strategic resolve that it is prepared to fight and win against a North Korean invasion of the South. These tests will probably be met with the deployment of strategic assets, possibly increased training on the peninsula, and additional pressure through ramped up sanctions enforcement, which is really necessary. Kim really needs to be cautious because at some point he will cross the line, and the U.S. with its allies may become fed up with the behavior of the childish Kim Jong-un and may decide to implement a full strategic strangulation campaign against the Kim family regime.
What was also notable from this joint statement from Seoul was that there was no mention of North Korea's human rights situations, showing a sign of potential policy discord between Seoul and Washington on the human rights issue. But before leaving Seoul, Secretary Blinken said in an interview with South Korea's SBS, the U.S. will continue to speak up and speak out when countries abuse human rights in egregious ways. We'll have to see where it goes from here. Dr. Bennett and Mr. Maxwell, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.